So now we're glad to have Joey Wong from Google Cloud. So he will be talking about the insights as a services. So Joey, so can you hear me? Can you hear me well?
Yes, Patrick, thank you very
Okay.
much.
Yeah,
All right,
and I can see
so
your screen
I'll
as
take over.
well. So yeah,
Perfect.
I pass the stage to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. So good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone's having a great day and enjoying the sessions. I certainly am. And listening to some of the previous speakers actually helps validate some of the things that I'll be talking about today. So while the DAC itself is mentioning telco data platform, what we're actually seeing is an emergence of data platforms and insights as a service across all industries, not just telco. But certainly from a presentation perspective, some of these aspects have actually been driven from a telco perspective. So while most of today's sessions have been focused and brought forth from a BFSI perspective, what I'll be presenting today is from the other side of the coin, where traditional communication service providers, or more commonly known as telcos, are creating new revenue streams and collaboration and partnerships with traditional banks and also fintechs as well. So, kind of to begin with, I kind of want to level set and in terms of setting the baseline in terms of what CSPs have been facing. As you can imagine, over the last few years, especially with things like the pandemic, COVID-19, CSPs have been hit very hard. They have been traditionally been into building networks and infrastructures, and therefore a lot of capex and subsequently a lot of OPEX spending were required to support that. With the pandemic, we had events such as working from home, hard lockdowns, even homeschooling, telehealth, and of course things like YouTube, Netflix, and streaming, videos of that nature coming into account. That has put a lot of strain in terms of the network and the infrastructure, and therefore the investments required by the CSPs. On top of that, we have these over-the-top or OTT players, which have made data monetization an everyday practice and eating into the traditional CSPs cash cows such as SMSs. And the challenges are fairly common across all the CSPs that we've worked with. The goals are also fairly common in terms of these CSPs want to become the trusted and reliable source of intelligent data, right? Which businesses and enterprise can actually use to drive decisions, not only decisions, but also actions in their respective worlds. So, one of the things that I picked up from the previous session, but I think it was Gary from Libby Bank, was the open finance and open economy world, where things like alternative credit scoring and alternative credit rating services were available. So I'll double click into that a little bit more as we go along. To kind of just put some numbers to help put some perspective into the picture, what you can see is over the last few years during the pandemic, there's been an increase in network demand, as I mentioned earlier. The reality of it's been up to like 60% or more in terms of internet traffic compared to pre-pandemic usage. And as you can imagine, the capex and opex expenditures have subsequently risen. All the while, the reports these CSPs are sharing in terms of revenue is that they're actually stagnating, or even cases where they're actually declining a little bit. So these CSPs are looking for new opportunities and ways to generate new revenue and revenue streams itself. So what are some of the opportunities that they could potentially look at? Obviously, what we're talking about today is going to be data platforms and offering analytics or insights as a service. The other ones are more well-known and traditionally known are things like the 5G edge computing capability, things like premium telco products like premium SMS and messaging, and obviously mobile virtual network operators. So I'll double click specifically on the first point today, but we're happy to talk about it from a Google perspective if you reach out at any point in time. Now, to kind of put it into perspective, while this topic itself has been driven largely by telco, research by analysts and also by Google, we can actually see that a lot of these you know span across different verticals itself. So it's not necessarily just a single industry that can potentially benefit by providing analytics as a service. When looking at research, the total global market and the potential addressable market is roughly 160 billion. And looking at the different sort of like broad categories, we've started noticing these categories in terms of being able to provide analytics around advertising, providing analytics around geospatial, financial, and things like image recognition, which is a little bit more specialized. Now, for advertising, that could be as simple as where should we put up a billboard? And that could be leveraging things like the spatial capabilities of understanding footfall analysis. As you can imagine, communication service providers actually understand a lot about where the customers are actually commuting, which networks they're connecting to, which cell towers they're connecting to. And that is all valuable information in terms of being able to make a decision and then an action for the advertising or marketing agencies to be able to stand up new billboards. For financial services, as Gary Lam mentioned before, in open finance economies, alternative credit scoring is also something that we see as an emerging opportunity as well. I'll double click into that one specifically as well. But before I do that, this represents just the broad categories across the different verticals and industries in terms of what is possible. I won't go through individual ones, but ultimately the deck itself will be available to be shared. Now, let's look at a specific use case for financial services and credit scoring itself. As you can imagine, telco companies capture a lot of information about their customers. So how long have they been a customer of their products and services? What types of devices do they use? Do they use an iPhone? Do they use an Android device? And even down to the manufacturer itself. Understanding, is it a premium Android device or is it a more cost-effective Android device? How often do they actually upgrade their devices? Do they upgrade every single year, or are they using an older device? Are they roaming? Are they going outside of their country more often, etc.? Now, from that, what they are potentially able to do is what we call API productization. By using all the telco data, they can create things like predictive scorecards, using the data itself to provide a financial health of a particular customer. If we look at things like in our APAC region, Indonesia represents, has about 275 million people in the population, Philippines 110, and Vietnam around 97 million. In terms of the unbanked population in Philippines, it represents about 66%, Indonesia at 51%, and Vietnam at 69%. This is a population that is unbanked and have no access to traditional banking services. This does not actually mean that they aren't financially healthy. It just means that the traditional banks have no view into the financial health of a particular person. By leveraging the telco data, they are able to predict the credit risk or credit rating for a particular customer itself. That is one API product that we can see our customers from the telco perspective are starting to create. The other way of actually providing this data is by providing raw telco data. And that can be terabytes of data where the financial institutions actually want to bring in and marry and merge with their own data sets to then be able to provide their own credit rating itself. Which then leads to the question of how do these CSPs actually start monetizing on these products itself? There are different ways of thinking about it. So some of the CSPs are actually looking at it from a duration perspective, right? So give me the raw data from a over the last 6 months, over the last 12 months perspective, so that they can marry with their own sets of data. Or perhaps as simple as predictive scorecard, where it's a simple, tell me about the financial health of a particular customer based on the data that you have. The other one is potentially based on the size, where they are keen to download gigabytes or even terabytes of telco data, so that they can marry into their own data sets. The other one is around things like predictive scorecards, where it's high value, but not necessarily high in terms of complexity from a size perspective. There are also other types of monetization models, such as revenue sharing, whereas perhaps if a financial institution is using the telco data to cross-sell, upsell, or even provide this credit rating capability, the revenue could actually be shared to the CSP itself. So what really forms a insights as a service platform itself? There are multiple things that go into it. At the very edge on the left-hand side, we see things like the data sources itself. So these are things that the telco already has. So it could be, as I kind of mentioned previously, the SIM duration, how long they have been the customer for, what sort of device, even location, and how often what type of digital interactions they have. And the next one over is the data platform. So the data platform takes all those data sources to then be able to do things like understand that data, to make sense of all that data itself, to be able to predict and ultimately personalize. That data platform and those three sort of like capabilities will then generate outputs. Outputs can be as simple as demand forecasting, understanding where the demand from the customer for what types of products and services are being generated. It can naturally be around network optimization or understanding demand movements. These outputs are very technical driven in terms of what they produce, but ultimately they need to be linked to value drivers itself. And that's where things like the new revenue streams, which we are talking about today, come into play. The other value drivers typically that we've seen are naturally around improving sales conversion, reducing churn, or increasing retention itself by improving things like customer experiences. Now, what we've seen is these value drivers are actually delivered by the APIs itself. And these APIs are an opportunity for these CSPs to then monetize and create new experiences as well. And this is a bit of a sort of like logical architecture in terms of where the data platform sits and where it needs to work across, not just from a traditional on-premise perspective, but also across other clouds as well. Regardless of where that data platform sits, whether it's on Google or one of the other cloud service providers, there are some typical challenges that come into play, right? And that's typically around providing how do they provide control access to the data and services assets that they want to share to the different channels above. How do they ensure data classification is in line with the data access being provisioned? And how do they ensure a common security and governance layer is being applied across the services and data assets? Because partnering up with a telco is not about just accessing their data sets, but they're also potentially leveraging their premium services, such as the premium messaging SMS capability as well. So they want to have a single and easy way to ensure that their new experiences that they're building is done as quickly as simply as possible. They also want to be able to create different business models. So taking the monetization models, perhaps thinking of new ways of creating new API products, and then ultimately be able to commercialize them as well. And then the other two is around providing guardrails in terms of how they want to be able to onboard the consumers and partnerships, and being able to provide personalized experiences for their customers as well. So, this is something that Google is working with, not only just telcos, but, lots of emerging, use cases with retailers as well, in terms of providing them a data ecosystem to be able to provide this capability for monetizing much quicker and faster. So as you can imagine, Google has a data platform. We have many, many different capabilities of being able to consume large amounts of data, be able to apply lots of machine learning to be able to understand and subsequently predict from the data sources itself. We then naturally have a way to provide these out as APIs, and that's part of the data platform enabler, which is Apigee. So from an Apigee perspective, we are an API management platform. One of that component is an API gateway. So we provide a quick and simple way of exposing APIs, but doing so in a well-controlled manner by providing a marketplace, the ability to classify the products and data, and naturally be able to provide monetization on that data itself. Okay. All right. So as a bit of an example in terms of data productization and classification, as you can imagine, there's a whole ton of APIs itself, right? Those APIs cross multiple disciplines and information. Data classification and productization, very much from a Google Apigee perspective, is API productization. Being able to take different parts of an API and then curating them into a specific API product, and that API product, having things like an SLA in terms of how many API calls are actually available as part of this product. How do you want to charge for that particular product itself? So this is actually very core to our platform, and this is something that's very keen to explore with more people joining this session today. And then lastly, in terms of the data marketplace, this is where a lot of our customers are looking for a quick way, an easy way to be able to stand up their own data marketplace by providing these APIs as products, and then naturally being integrated into their own payment systems or into other open payment gateways as well. So this is where the API products, the classifications, and then subsequently making it available and published is something that we help our customers do today. And I believe that is it. So thank you very much for your time today. I hope it's been a little bit useful in terms of sharing some of the things that we've seen from a Google perspective, and naturally from a Apigee and an API management perspective as well. Patrick?
Okay, so yeah, thanks, thanks Joey for your sharing. So it's just also interesting for you to help to share from the telco angle. So I believe there's some maybe not many audiences from that background, but we do heard that from telco there's also quite some in Hong Kong, and then they have also have some stake in some virtual banks. So it is interesting sharing. So okay, so I think back to some basic question. So I think for telco, similar to banks and insurance, they have a lot of things to do. They also have a lot of data. So how can you help them to justify the first step? I think the first step is always most difficult, especially for those well-established enterprise. So how can they work out the early ROI, or how can they do the data product, or even how can they monetize them? What is the typical journey from your perspective?
No, that's a fantastic question, Patrick. And the reality of it is most customers do not begin with with monetization, right? They don't wake up one day and suddenly go, I want to monetize my data. The real question is what can be monetized itself. So having an understanding of what your customers are actually wanting, right? And customers in the broad sense from a partnership perspective. What would be some of the interesting things that customers would be interested in utilizing? And those customers can be internal customers as well. So having an API layer where you can actually start capturing metrics around what type of data is being consumed firstly internally, right? Understanding what type of data and how they're actually consuming it becomes important. Once they get a better understanding of that, they can iterate through in terms of then engaging perhaps external partners to then share some of the insights to then perhaps collaborate and formulate some interesting business models and understanding what data they can bring to the table to then generate these API products. So to kind of like make the answer more succinct and short, it's about analytics, being able to capture the analytics to then understand what your customers are actually asking for from a product and a data perspective.
Okay, so I got your point. So
Mm,
maybe I think I just do an analogy like my experience
mm,
when working with open banking. So there's always a challenge talking about okay who push first. For example, in the open banking, there may be some use cases banks want to push for, while there may be
mm.
some is actually pull from the partner. So the partner propose some contest use cases. So from your experience when working with those telco data, is it from the telco's perspective, they want to monitor their assets, or there may be some actual leaks? So the people is actually requesting that. So I know that your experience is
Yeah.
maybe from Australia, from the others. So can
Mhm.
you share a bit to our audience?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, some of it's actually come from more of the ASEAN region itself. So I think it was either Indonesia or Philippines where the banks were looking for alternative credit ratings. All right, because as I kind of mentioned, Indonesia has a very large population that is unbanked. So these traditional banks, have no financial insights into a large size of the population, meaning that
Mm,
they don't have any products that the banks are offering. But as you can imagine, in ASEAN, almost everyone has a cell phone, right? And and subsequently a data plan, a mobile plan itself. So the telcos actually have a bunch of, as you can imagine, insights into the financial health of a particular customer from a telco perspective. So in that particular case, the traditional bank actually reached out to the telco to actually see if that's something that they would be willing to provide as a product or service itself. In that particular case, it was actually the bank reaching out.
got that, got that. So
Mhm,
another question is that I said so we do also have chance to work with telco actually in Hong Kong, and then we can
mhm,
see that what I talked to them before is so we have already got a very robust infrastructure in place, and then they have difficulty to actively reactivate or actually refresh them because there's so many things. They may have difficulty how to classify them, how to make it as a product, just as what you mentioned. So being a data API or a data product API is very different because they need to do the business analysis, how it can find a sustainable product or etc. So in general, how those people will be engaging or proposing the initial maybe data product from your experience? The first one
Sure.
maybe, yeah.
Yeah, so certainly a lot of these things are internally driven, right? So they have data scientists that are actually looking at the data sets itself and trying to find interesting and new and innovative sort of like data sets and use cases from the data that they have already. Um, so we've seen that traditionally driven internally, but then also taking that to market in terms of trying to form relationships with financial institutions. So this is going back to that your question around who initiates it, who does it first, right?
Mm,
Um, we see it from both sides, where
mm,
more perhaps traditional banks are struggling and kind of like uh, you know, facing competitive threats from fintechs, right? Where they
mm.
want
Yeah,
to
yeah,
do
yeah.
something interesting, right? But they haven't been able to. So they're now coming up with different ways to be able to collaborate with, verticals and industries that are outside their own, uh, to be able to create these new experiences and potentially look to address a larger audience from a market perspective.
Okay, I got the points. So
Mm.
thanks for sharing. I think the time is almost up. So hopefully we also have some time to have some chat offline, and we do see some
Mhm.
interesting thing happen in Hong Kong as well. So thanks again, Joey, for your time. Okay, so see you
Excellent.
soon.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Patrick. Bye bye.